Whoa! Alrighty. Well, welcome to TJsRC. Today we're going to take a look at setting up these Racing 100mm internal spring shocks. Although I do think they're pretty great. This is just me sharing how they work and getting them set up for running on the TRX4 here. I have had them for a while, made a few different changes. Today we're going to talk about where I have them currently set up. So let's head over to the bench and see what they're made of. Now the reason I went with these internal spring shocks is because of all of the different tuning options. There is ability to change the amount of preload, which determines how high your vehicle sits. However, unlike the stock shocks, you can't change the preload while the shocks are on the vehicle. You do have to completely remove them. Now the way that these shocks allow you to adjust preload is by changing the spring rate. You've got these light springs, medium springs, and very heavy springs. What I'll be focusing on is the medium springs here and the softer springs. Now I've done some playing around with different setups with these shocks. When I first got them, I went with the light spring, put that in, and then just assembled the shock like so, and tried running this. The reason I went with the super light spring was I was thinking that the weight of the vehicle being pretty heavy would allow it to have kind of a low center of gravity when it was sitting still, and yet allow lots of suspension travel. The other feature that this style of shock offers, and that is to run what is called a droop setup. In a droop setup, you run a spring on the opposite side of the piston from the regular spring. This forces the suspension to sit in a partially extended state. And then to get full extension of your suspension, it requires weight transfer to pull that suspension completely extended. And when that weight transfer diminishes, the spring then pulls the suspension back to a center. My first experiment was experimenting with one of these short springs here so that it had a small amount of forced droop. Today, we're going to be building a 50% droop setup by removing this C-clip here, which you have to remove this part in order to install the droop spring on the opposite side of this piston. So I went ahead and removed that. Now here is a very, very important note. You do not get extra C-clips like this. They come with a whole bunch of other parts. Extra O-rings, there's extra seals in the kit, but there are no extra C-clips. So when you take this off, you must do so very carefully so that you don't lose it, because there aren't any extras in the box. So we're gonna set that right there in the middle. We're gonna take the lightweight spring that we're going to use for our droop, put that on, and I have chosen to go with the one-hole piston, and we're gonna run a very lightweight oil. I feel like the two kind of complement each other pretty well, but that's just personal. You don't have to. You can just play around with various oil weights if you want to concern yourself with the dampening rate of the shock. And that's just a personal preference. You may decide otherwise, and that's okay. Now we're going to install the medium length, medium weight spring in both. Now we're about ready for our oil. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm going with a very lightweight oil. We're using 10 weight today. I don't know how well you can see in there, but we're going to be filling the oil level up just past the top of that spring. Between the piston, the rod, and this spring going in there, it's going to take up a lot of space, and we want to put just enough in that it just barely starts to squeeze out once we assemble this all the way. Now you want to screw this all the way down right before that rubber seal begins to touch. For this next step, I like to wrap paper towel around here because oil is going to be squirting out. This way the paper towel soaks up some of it. We're going to slowly push this down. And if we have way too much oil in there at this point, it would have squirted out the edge. Now, before we take our wrench and tighten this down all the way, we're going to compress this all the way to the bottom, then do our tightening. There. Rub clean off any little drips that came through. All right. And that is one put together. Let's quickly get the other one assembled. Our oil. Make sure I don't pinch any of that paper towel in there. Now you can see here that the forced droop forces the shock to sit in this partially extended state. Now I used the light spring on the top side of that piston so that it doesn't take a lot of weight to extend the suspension, but just a little bit. And I used a little bit stiffer one on the bottom, which is my preload shock. That will determine the ride height or the suspension level when the vehicle is sitting still. I'm gonna go ahead and put these on the truck and we'll take a look and see how it sits now. So here it sits with the internal spring shocks completely done. We did the first two off camera beforehand, and then the second two you just watched us finish now. We're gonna leave this setup as is, run it for a while, and then make some observations and decide if we need to make any adjustments or not. That's kind of how you have to do it with these internal spring shocks, because it's not as simple as just reaching in here and, you know, turning a collar. But I do want to highlight when your truck is on a side hill like so, running a forced droop setup, you've got springs on the front and back that are forcing that body to stay down. Where the way I had it set up originally when I first put these shocks on is I had just the one large spring on the bottom. When you would side hill, the weight of the body would start to pull, and then the suspension would just unload, and you see that body would start to tip, and that just pulled it over. But now, when I side hill, you'll notice as the angle slowly increases, there's very little body roll. So having that spring on the other side of that piston forces the body to stay more level to the suspension and keep the traction on the ground instead of tumbling down the hill. If there's something else related to these stocks that you want to know, go ahead and ask that question in the comments. I really appreciate the feedback, and I hope to see you in the next one.